Hello, friends, and welcome to the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick Macfarlane, and with me on the horn, I have Jose Gallison. How are you doing, bud?
Doing great. Just killing it lately. Just having fun. You?
Yeah, you've been real busy, man.
Yeah, I know. I'm just having fun. Networking, meeting people. Just I don't know. I feel like I'm just getting to that point where you're just. I don't know. We're just meeting some, doing a lot of networking. I don't know. Just living life, having a fun time. We were talking before how I kind of went to the Soho debate, so I kind of just met more Liberty people and just I don't know. Just really fun. You meet new people, new discussions. I don't know. Talked to Reed recently, because I was renowned for saying that Lib Unity is fake and gay, but now he's got me to come around to at least that is fake and gay in one sense and also base and awesome in another. It just depends on your view. So,
Yeah, I was thinking just now that when we did our first installment of this series, so this is the second episode you'll see from the title, but we're talking about the monopoly on violence. We're doing a documentary review of that. But when we started it out with episode 1 on your show, I was like, dude, you're busy. You've been doing all kinds of stuff. So it just hasn't ended.
Yeah, it never ends.
Yeah.
Just keeps on going. Big one. I got Phil Labonte. I don't know how I landed that whopper. I got him on, I think, Thursday I'm recording. I mean, I don't know when this will drop, but it probably still won't be released by the time this comes out. So I was really excited about that. But
I would. I was gonna ask him on, but I think I'd be afraid that I'd ask him too much about Killswitch Engage. Just like, remember that time that you filled in for Howard Jones on Killswitch Engage?
Oh, I didn't even know that was a thing, honestly.
Oh, hell yeah! So do you listen to All That Remains at all?
I don't listen to them like religiously. They were like a huge band of mine in like high school. Like I listened to Fall of Ideals like religiously. Like it was like always on when I was like I don't know if it was my senior or junior summer while I was out doing degenerate stuff. But yeah, it's played a big part of my life for sure. But I don't know if I'm not like I religiously follow or anything like that. But it definitely is very like surreal to be like talking to this guy that I used to like. I don't know, listen to while I was railing pills off off a toilet in some convenience store or something.
Well, and I think that I would. Sorry for the folks who don't know who Phil Labonte is. He's the lead singer of All That Remains. He's a libertarian. He's a Ron Paul guy, right? And so he's been active in the libertarian community. He was on Tim Pool a few times, and so he's a cool guy. But I've always been a Killswitch Engage fan and not much of an All That Remains fan. But I knew that he filled in for Howard Jones when he left the band, and he did a whole tour with Killswitch. So I'd probably just, anyways, talk about that a whole bunch. So I would ask him on. I'd be too starstruck because I've known who he is for a long time, man.
Yeah, I was a little starstruck. I shot my shot. I was actually debating whether he would shoot my shot. I sent like some tweet and like about like some episode he was on somewhere else, and then he like liked it and then retweeted it, and then I was like, well, then I commented like, hey man, I'd love to have you show, blah 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 blah, like kind of like on Twitter, and then he liked it, but he never replied. So then I was like in this weird like, do I DM him? Like
slide in.
Yeah, so I was like, I did, but I was very on the edge. It's like almost like it's like with women when you're like dating. I mean, me and you're both married, but it's like they send these signals, and we're just dumb men. And you're like,
right.
Do you want me or not?
You should ask Phil about that.
Yeah, right. I mean, I can completely get it. I mean, he has like something ridiculous, like almost 100,000 followers, so I'm sure he's just getting blown up all the time. So,
well, I mean, hey man, if you never ask, then it's not going to happen.
Yep.
Someone's not going to bug you about coming on your podcast, unless you're like Joe Rogan or something. So. Yeah, so let's get started off here. Where we left off was with the social contract, and I know we covered a whole lot of issues, and a lot of them that I have never talked about before, like education. We talked about a whole bunch, but we left off on the social contract, and this is actually a topic I covered a lot kind of early on in my show. So, in your episode you talk about, your article you talk about the social contract. We'll have a link in the show notes page here. This should be libertyweekly.net/166. But you talk about how Michael Huemer came on the documentary, and then Jeff Deist was going through and talking about it too. Anything just to start us off with, Jose?
I do like how humor it breaks down the social contract. I've heard him do it a few times. That was probably one of the earliest times hearing him break it down. It's just great because he breaks down very logical. It's very much like seeing like Spooner break down the Constitution. It comes from a very logical, completely like legal framework of like, this is why this is dumb. And yeah, I mean, you probably have more to add to it than I do. This isn't my wheelhouse. This is definitely your spot, the social contract and such. I just know at the end of the day, I didn't sign Jack. So, you know.
Well, yeah, and I mean, my take on it's very Spoonerite. I just kind of tried to adapt it for the more modern time, more modern arguments. I'm trying to find my episode number where I did a deep dive on this. But basically, I mean, we didn't agree to anything. Everyone is dead now. Even like if the Constitution is the closest thing I think we have to a real social contract, the Constitution cannot be a contract because it's lacking in the actual elements, because there's elements to a contract formation. There's an offer, acceptance of that offer, and a mutual assent and consideration. And those are things you learn in law school, but not to get too technical, but libertarian contract theory doesn't believe in consideration. It's just this concept of a bargain for exchange that you get in law school. But essentially, I mean, it's all jack, because what would you say that the offer is? Is there any real offer? Like the state comes in and they don't care if you assent or not.
Yeah, I mean that kind of gets at with the the biggest thing for me is implied consent, because that's always the argument that they go to is implied consent. That it's just implied. Like, what do you mean? Like, you could just ask me. And I know that's one thing humor goes into a lot, that's like, but they don't. And there's a reason why they don't, because they know that there would be people who didn't. So that it's like kind of the assuming that people would take this contract without asking them is kind of a perfect little cop-out to get out of having to ask them, knowing full well there would be people who wouldn't, and that would kind of make their whole system fall apart. And it's funny too, because you'll hear people make that argument. They're like, well, yeah, but then it would this wouldn't be able to do it. Like, there would be people who wouldn't. And it's like that. Yeah, that's the point exactly. like that's exactly the point. There are people who wouldn't, and your system wouldn't work. And that's the whole flaw with this. So it's inherently, you don't just get to say you have my consent because you want my consent. Like, that's not how that works, So.
Or they'll say something about like, this concept of an implied contract is where, you go into a store and you grab a candy bar and you go up to the cash register and you put the candy bar on the cash register. Even though there wasn't any communication or anything there was certain actions that were taken, which would say there's an implicit agreement here. Is that, I'm going to pay for this candy bar and you're going to sell it to me, and I'm going to walk out of the store and, put money on the counter or whatever. But that doesn't, I mean, that just, you can't point to anything like that aside from, I'm here, I've stayed on this piece of dirt for long enough. I've used the roads and the public utilities that are in place because I have no other choice, right? That's the key distinction here. And if I don't pay for it, I'll be extorted at gunpoint. So in duress is, it's a defense to contract formation. So going into that too, but the Constitution, it cannot be legislation either, and or any social contract, because, and I use Tom Woods here. This is libertyweekly.net/28. But I use Tom Woods's argument. I don't know if you ever heard this episode of the Tom Woods Show. He goes into, like, I think it was Robert Nozick's explanation of when does someone else represent me? Like, so, I make one vote. I'm one of 300,000 people that vote for a senator, and that senator goes to Congress, and, I don't have any control over what he says. Does that person represent me? And then he kind of takes it back by degrees. And I say that the only true representation would be an agency relationship where I have recourse against my representative if they don't do what I say. So that's kind of the legal concepts behind it. So anything, sorry to kind of go off there, Jose, but
no, I mean, to bring it back, the only way I've ever been able to make the contract theory sort of kind of work, and even then I guess it kind of sidesteps the contract theory, is if you assume that the federal government has a proper and legitimate property claim over the entirety of the United States. And that's kind of where you get into property rights and how you're like, well, that's not, no, they don't have a legitimate claim to it. And so that's the only way it works. And I mean, that's kind of, man, I'm about to drone on doing a whole other thing and going to Hoppa's friggin' covenant things, but we'll move on.
Okay.
I'm sure we'll probably go more into that later. I forget what all we got left. So.
Well, I was going to say it'd be fine if you did, but I got a whole, I started working in real estate now, and there's this concept of, it's just fascinating how we actually deal with property claims, because this whole system has come up about, how you do that. It's one thing to, wax poetic as a libertarian, a Hoppian, propertarian, but actually seeing that happen. But of course, it all comes with, in the United States, all property title originates from patent, which is when the United States government writes on a piece of paper that, John Brown Farmer has the old 40, on section range, whatever. So, I don't know. It's just the whole system is just set up in a statist way. Mm. So the next paragraph here, we're talking about the next one is democracy. So first we go from the social contract, then democracy, and is it humor or Hoimer? It's a German thing. I know when they put the E after the U, it's like an umlaut. I think it's Michael Humer, but
that's how I've always seen it pronounced. So,
okay. Yeah. I'm terrible at pronouncing things, so
I got you.
And then Dave Smith comes into that, this myth of democracy, and I know that we touched on this in our last episode, but we kind of go from the divine right of kings through history, like the idea that the monarch and the leader was literally endowed by God or the gods and chosen to rule over everyone else, to kind of something that seems a little more participatory, where people have kind of seen through the illusion, because throughout the years we scramble at authority to argue against the king, saying they can't do certain things. So now they reinvent things kind of around World War I, topple all the monarchs, and come up with this idea of democracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it is kind of funny how I've kind of always had this idea that democracy was, I mean, I know for me, like growing up through, public school and stuff, I had this concept that democracy was an improvement. I mean, I did, even under the lore of the founding fathers and stuff, I was like, but it's not as good as a constitutional republic, but it's still an improvement from monarchy. But it's like, that's one of the great things about Hoppas. I genuinely believe that a true monarchy is preferable to democracy. Because, I mean, once you start analyzing it from a very logical way, so then you start realizing, oh shit, like this move to democracy was a regression, so yeah, I mean, because in a sense, like, while it is perverse under monarchy, you can it kind of makes more sense in a lot of ways. It's almost like they kind of have it's like property claims, and I don't know, it's definitely preferable. We can obviously go into the weeds there, but it's just funny how our modern sensibilities is how democracy is this good thing. And even then, it's ironic because we do have this constitutional republics are preferable, but even then there's always this weird hallowed nature of any time democracy is, called forth as a word, even amongst Republicans, but it's weird. They'll talk out of both sides of their mouth. They'll be like how democracy is, the majority, but both sides, when they need to, they will call upon the hallowed name of democracy, even then, but on the other side of their mouth, they will fully be like, oh, well, it's a constitutional republic. They're kind of playing both sides of the field. You know what I mean? But even then, it's kind of a hide the ball type thing, because when really it's like, well, both suck. Constitutional republic is just, a democracy with more steps. So that's all it is.
Yeah, and I think both of them have the tendency to create an oligarchical class, essentially. And I think one of the big arguments as to why monarchy is preferable, and I see this as a good argument, is that time preference and the fact that incentives matter. So if the government is essentially privately owned by a monarch, does the monarch not have the incentive to preserve the kingdom for his own lifetime, but also for his progeny and his line? So you can see the time preference setting up there, but then again, you have the problem of inept rulership as well. Like what happens if the king turns out to be a wastrel or something like that.
And that's why monarchs died like dropped like a God, I forget what the friggin'
the guillotine.
Well, there's a friggin' thing I was trying to. They died like crazy back in the day. Yeah, that's why there was always someone else taking over from someone else. Someone's brother killed someone. They kind of take care of that themselves, and then it also kind of goes into warfare in those systems. While we did have a tendency of people thought they were more bloody, but really it was like, but it was like the royal classes that were engaging in warfare, and the peasants kind of stayed out of it. And even then, it was kind of like it's almost like it was a more fair deal, because under feudal systems, it was like, hey, here's a deal. Here's your parchment of land. You get to be a lord over this, but your deal is when I call upon you, you're going to come fight. I mean, that seems like a pretty fair deal. I mean, obviously it's not ideal. We have our issues, and it kind of kept the peasants out of it. It was kind of like you almost had responsibility that came along with that, whereas now we send our poor to go fight our wars. So,
And too, on the same side, you had some recourse, some ways to restrain the king, because I've done, I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I've done a fair amount of work on just the conceptual behind what led to the Magna Carta, and the bare fact that all of the royals, in a sense, all the barons and the king's court, they restrained the king because the king needed the cooperation of the court to do what he wanted to do. And so they eventually found out their own power and realized that they could, hold the purse strings. And that was the first concept of limiting the powers of the monarch that came into being. So at least in Great Britain, in England. And I think there's a real tradition of liberty in England that doesn't get the credit I think it deserves.
Yeah, and one thing I was kind of touching on, I don't know if I made it very clear for those listening, I was also kind of getting at how democracy dissipates responsibility. So you have, in a monarchy, in that type of society, you have, in theory, one king. And he is the one who most people see as responsible for, in some sense, all the goings on. I mean, you can kind of sort of dissipate the responsibility by lords and so on and so forth, but ultimately, it's him. So it's like you have this person that you can off with the head if it comes to if you want to change things. Like obviously I'm not saying that necessarily would change things. I mean I have my issues with like revolutions and stuff like that. I don't think that's the way to go. But I'm a big fan of Labonte, the just walk away or whatever kind of deal. But yeah, I mean there is something to that. That king feels that responsibility. That's kind of why they had the whole divine right of kings and it got tied up in religion. Because it was like they were trying to, in some sense, dissipate the responsibility. Like, yeah, but God, but remember God, like he's the reason why. But I feel like a lot of people probably realize to some extent that was kind of a cop out. And at the end of the day, it was him. It's on his head, and that's why a lot of kings got separated from their heads. So,
And another problem that you had, and I'm not trying to argue or anything. This is just what happened. Was like, you would have a huge crisis in the country that would last for a long time if there was ever a king that died without heirs, or if there was a dispute as to, there's a word for this, but it's like the lineage of how crown would pass from person to person. And it's like, could you imagine a political issue being framed in like, who was the closest heir? Like who was closest related to the king, and then you have like different people backing different bids on the throne, and then there's like wars and shit. So it's just I don't know, it's all bad. So yeah. Anarchy is the best. Yeah,
but it also too, like I was kind of thinking in my head, it almost made it like these like royal skirmishes and stuff almost were very much akin to like competing gangs or mobs. I mean, so in some sense, in the idea of the concept of, the illusion of authority, I feel like it almost was better in a sense than what we have with democracy now, because it is like, I don't know who I was listening to, but I was listening to someone they were kind of going to in those days. It very much was like when they had those going on, it was kind of like the peasants were kind of like, well, they're doing their thing. And it wasn't like they were in any way involved. They were just kind of like, oh, and it's kind of the same thing when you have two competing gangs. Like, yeah, there might be people caught in the crossfire, but like, you're not really their intended target. They're fighting amongst themselves. Just stay out of it, and whatever. So, while there is a little bit different because those peasants did, to some extent, recognize them as having, authority over them, but it was In another sense, they also were like, yeah, but was it not my pig? That kind of expression, like whatever, So it's a little bit better than democracy, where it's like everyone has a stake in this. We are the government, like that kind of thing,
Yeah.
So.
And I might be mistaken, but the way that I understand it is that it wasn't until really, you see this a little bit in the Civil War, the American Civil War, but it seems like it wasn't really until World War I came along that you had the Civil War, where civilians were specifically being targeted. Like in the Civil, obviously there were like raping, of cities and villages and towns and regions in the past, but it wasn't so explicit until World War I. And in Civil War they had like the bloody Georgia, the burning of Savannah, Atlanta.
Civil War was pretty awful, but that was mostly one side and not the side people think that was doing.
Oh that. Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah. Well, let's. So we're 3 paragraphs in now. I do this all the time. So the next one, David Friedman was the next speaker in the Monopoly on Violence, and he talks about how he's a law professor, so he talks about how inherently state actors do not bear any cost of their actions. It's all socialized, and this is what you were talking about. It's democracy gives this illusion of we are the government, so therefore, when state actors damage or harm people, those state actors don't have to pay for it. It's actually the taxpayers that have to pay for it. So Judge Andrew Napolitano comes on. He talks about how the government has interpreted the Commerce Clause, basically has made Congress tyrants in the eyes of the law. And McMakin and Stephan Kinsella come and point out how government is unnecessarily using principles of how government is unnecessary, and they use principles of international law to prove that point. So anything just to add right off the bat?
Yeah, the Friedman one's probably the biggest thing that stands out for me, because what he's getting at is the incentive problem, which we've kind of danced around a little bit here in this discussion so far. But the incentive problem was probably one of the biggest things that was like, I mean, it wasn't one of the ones that like made any major shift, but once that clicked in my head, I was kind of like, oh, like, because that is a big thing, because it's like, because the whole idea of like minarchy is like, well, if only we could get good people in, or if only we could, but it's like, but the idea is like, we have the structure and you have to analyze its incentives, and all of its incentives go one way. And sure, you could get all the best people in and you might get some sort of small win and move it a certain way, but you know what? It's just going to go right back because the incentives are the way they are. And that's kind of what he's getting at there, in that, I mean, there's not really even any way you can get around that, is these elected officials bear no responsibility for, I mean, they do in a sense. You could be like, oh, well, they might not get voted in. But, like, let's be real. Like, the populace at large, do they really pay attention to every little nitnoid, budget proposal and stuff like that? No, they don't. So at the end of the day, if so-and-so, votes for this thing, that's a huge, public works project that's super overbloated or whatever, like, and it's, obviously so-and-so is probably getting kickbacks. He's probably never going to pay have to pay anything for that. The only, even if, like, I kind of brought up corruption a little bit even there, the only time, like, corruption ever becomes a thing is when they go against each other. And then that's when it becomes a thing. Like we saw that with Trump, where he kind of like rocked the boat a little bit. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, look at this corruption, but everyone's engaged in corruption. I mean, I kind of went off the weeds a little bit there, but yeah, no, the incentives issues are all off. And it's just like they bear nothing for it. So it's like, you look at Biden, he's like damn near at the average death age at this point. Like, he has probably maybe a decade left of his life. Like, he could completely tank the United States and nothing would come of it. At the end of the day, he would enrich himself and his family, and he could completely just bankrupt the nation entirely, and he's going to have paid nothing for it whatsoever. So, yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, or I got rant over.
No. Well, I saw this today at work. So get this. If the local county treasurer, if they miscalculate taxes and they end up charging people less money for taxes than is proper, than they actually owe, the county can retroactively go back and collect those taxes. Ooh. Now, I think there is a statute of limitations of 2 or 3 years, but the county can still go back and they can even collect taxes from people who don't own the property anymore. And so it's like, even if the state official makes a mistake, there's no, the state is still owed their due. There's no recourse against the county treasurer. The state can still, go and knock people up that's a different definition, but they can knock those people around for their tax due. And it's like, I always try, and this is like it's a little needle, a little bomb that I slip normies, is like, I always ask them this question, like, so if you own a piece of land in fee simple, you own it outright, and you still have to pay property taxes on it every year, is that land ever really yours? You essentially have to pay rent to the government. So is that land really yours?
I mean, no.
I
mean, you either own it or you don't. I mean, that's kind of the concept of ownership. So
yeah,
I mean, yeah,
it's a feudal system. I mean, you're really just leasing the land.
Yeah.
In a sense, I guess the property taxes, I'm pretty sure they go exclusively to your county or your local government. But still, it's your local, fife lord? Is that what they call them? The baron?
I don't remember what those terms.
So, just to touch on McMakin and Kinsella, I can't remember the points that they made about international law, but have you ever heard the theory that like the states of the world already exist in a state of anarchy? Like
yes.
The government, yeah.
That's what he was getting at, if I remember correctly. That
yeah,
the whole concept of, they're like, well, anarchy can't happen, but it's like, well, if you look at if you look at the countries almost as if they were individuals, if we pretended they were individual, entities, they kind of interact in that regard, anyways. So, yeah.
So in the next portion here, and I have to admit that I'm not as well read on like the different kinds of anarchy. I've heard some things about anarcho-syndicalism and mutualism and anarcho-communism, of course, anarcho-primitivism, transhumanism. I'm forgetting a whole bunch. Christian anarchism. So what? I know that I think you're a little more studied than I am on this topic. So I don't know if you want to just. What are some highlights of this section of the documentary?
Oh, you're gonna have to refresh me a little bit on that part. Maybe breeze over the paragraph, because I don't have it in front of me. So I don't.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So basically, we're just talking about all of the figures of anarchy's past, like Emma Goldman, Lysander Spooner, Rothbard. But Proudhon, I'm sure, is one person that was talked about in the documentary. Isn't there a Tolstoy was one the Christian anarchist?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, if that's this part I remember correctly, they kind of do go more into kind of the origins of anarchy and how they do. I know a lot of people of our ilk really regret to say it, but it does have its roots in left anarchy. With maybe socialism, anarcho-communism, whatever you want to call it. I mean, socialism and communism to some extent are basically kind of borderline interchangeable. I mean, I don't know. I know some people will define. I was literally listening to a debate with Keith Knight today, and he had a socialist on who literally said the exact thing. They're exchangeable. It's kind of the hide the ball thing. Like I've heard other people say before, socialists who say, well, communism and socialism are not the same thing. Whatever. Basically the same thing. It's really just a matter of degrees. But yeah, and I mean, that's kind of where it came from. Emma Goldman is one of the earlier ones, so that's a good example of it. And it is kind of cool to see these older figures and where they came from. I think even Spooner had some like kind of lefty-ish kind of views on things. Because I know I've gotten a couple arguments before where people were like shitting on Spooner, and you're kind of like, well, I mean, I don't know. He's still better than damn near everyone else at the time.
Right.
So,
I can land some critiques of Spooner, but I like Spooner a lot. So
yeah. But I don't know. Yeah, this goes into it. I mean, obviously Spooner is a warm spot in my heart. Emma Goldman's very cool. I mean, she's based as hell. But like, and she was like, I don't know, say what you will about whether you think her philosophy was completely consistent or not. I would say it's probably not, because I mean, I'm like of the ANCAP type, ANCAP agorist, whatever. So I definitely have my issues, but I do get very irritated with a lot of R type who do like shit on the left anarchists of like being like, oh, well, that's a contradiction in terms. Like, yeah, sure, maybe technically, but it's like at the end of the day, you got to interact with people and individuals, and it's like, they can, I don't know, they can still be coming from a principled idea in their head. It's just they may have some flaws.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, no one's perfect. So
I think a good, if I may, a good example of this, and I don't know if she's an anarchist or not, but Caitlin Johnstone, like, I don't know if you read her work at all, but she's a journalist. She's lefty, but she's red-pilled, and she's really good on the war issue. So, obviously I critique some things about her, but honestly, I would rather be friends with a red-pilled left anarchist than I would not be friends, but have a discussion with a red-pilled left anarchist than a blue-pilled, minarchist.
Yeah, I'd rather have Jimmy Dore on my show than Justin Amash.
Yeah.
Like, personally, like, I mean, it's not even like I'm not even really like slighting against Amash, but he is objectively blue-pilled as much as he may not like that. You listen to the Malice episode. I'm not even trying to shit on him. He's great in a lot of ways, but
yeah,
he is. I don't know. I doubt if he hates the state. You know what I mean? I very much doubt that. You ask him if he hates the state, it was like, well, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, this doesn't require speech.
Right. The Malice's test of whether someone is right wing or left wing.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there is something to there. I don't know. There's a lot of good people on the left. And then you also got to look at things through historical lens and realize how things came about and realize how much there was to philosophies being worked out. Like, I mean, we look at it came from the left, and we like to think, and I do agree that we have the consistent principle or consistent position. But at the same time, you have to realize they didn't have all these thinkers. Like everyone, there's no such thing as
Well, I think I lost Jose here, so I'm going to keep going until he can rejoin. But I think you're right, Jose. Like, there's no such thing as the internet at that time, and in a way, it's a lot more impressive for someone to be able to be well read at that time and come up with these more original ideas without having the benefit of having these, like the internet and all these other sources of information to rely upon. Right? Did you come in on that?
I lost for a second. I don't know where you went with that, but it looked like you saved it by continuing talking.
Yeah, well, basically, I think you were getting at this is that there's not a lot of ideas floating around at that time. You don't have the internet. I mean, you have books and stuff, and oddly enough, a lot of people were well read at that time, but you don't have the Library of Alexandria at your fingertips at that time.
Yeah, I know that's kind of what I was getting at. That there's they were at a bit of a disadvantage, and you're looking at these people from centuries ago and being like, well, they weren't right. And it's like, yeah, you have the advantage of a whole lot of time and a whole lot of advancement. So and yes, they actually generally those people were better read, but I feel like there was probably less of a competing of ideas, if there will, because they may be well read, but they were well read in whatever they could get their hands on, which it wouldn't be as varied as what we can get our hands on,
Right.
So, but
yeah. It's different in some ways. I don't know if you've heard people talk about this, is that the wealth of information at our fingertips is actually dumbing us down on the large, because we don't have to commit things to memory or have a base knowledge. We can just rely, or the amount of information is just so overwhelming that there's no time to really dig into it. So,
yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at, because you can shit on Emma Goldman and be like, she has the wrong position, but it's like, yeah, but I guarantee you she was way smarter and probably way better read than you were, or me or you were. But we have the advantage of all these wide range of resources.
Yeah.
So we have been able to evaluate different competing ideas to a better degree.
So right here, it's like, oh shit, when did that happen? Oh yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Wait, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So anyways, So then we kind of get to this, the presentation of the libertarian non-aggression principle, and Walter Block comes on to talk about that, kind of popularized by Murray Rothbard. And I don't know how much we really have to go into that, because I'm sure everyone in the audience is very intimately familiar with the idea of the non-aggression principle. But then Ryan McMakin kind of talks about Well, do you want to touch on this difference, Jose, between a minarchist and an anarchist?
I kind of want to. You were saying it. I would like to briefly touch on the NAP. I'm sure anyone watching probably did, but just for the sake of it, you never know who's watching across it. The NAP is, basically, if you're a libertarian worth a damn, that is the backbone of your philosophy to some extent. I mean, I kind of have minor disagreements in a sense, but I mean that's a way deeper discussion. But for all intents and purposes, the NAP should be the backbone of your philosophy if you're a libertarian worth a damn. And the NAP, all this is a non-aggression principle, means you don't get to fuck with people that didn't fuck with you. And by that you mean like legitimate aggressions. You can kind of get a semantic thing where like aggressions, or is that just someone being mean to you? Like, no, this is someone harming you or your property. And I know you can kind of get in the weeds of discussing it, but that's basically people hurt you or take your stuff, and that's it. And the only time you get to hurt people or take their stuff is if they hurt you or take your stuff. And it's really that simple. I know it seems crazy, and a lot of people who don't understand the philosophy are like, well, yeah, no shit. But it's like, yeah, well, now apply that to everything, and you're at anarchy. So, because, I mean, yeah. But I'm not going to go on that too much. And anyone who's interested in NAP, you can look in far deeper. But I figured since we brought it up, we should at least mention it briefly.
Sure, but, yeah. No, but so then if we're on kind of basic libertarian stuff, what is the difference between a minarchist and an anarchist? 6 months of reading?
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. I've dropped that a few times on the show.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was like actually reading, period, because I got through minarchy from listening to podcasts, and I just hadn't got back into reading yet, because, I don't know, I mean, I've probably talked before, but I kind of went through, like, I read a ton as a kid, and then, like, I kind of got into, like, the jock and, like, kind of thing, and I got into, like, I don't know, hanging out with my buddies and stuff, and it was just almost, like, not the cool thing. And I know, like, now it's, like, I look back, and I'm like, I was such a nerd for caring what other people thought, like, you know what I mean? Like, so it's kind of, like, wasn't the cool thing to do. I kind of stopped reading as much. It was also one of those things where I was, like, one of the smartest kids in my class and whatever, so it's kind of, like, I don't know, I guess kind of got away from it, and I kind of rode off my smarts from all that time of reading my entire time through high school, because public school is a joke. And yeah, anyways, yeah, I kind of got there. I started reading again, like, much later after getting into, like, becoming a full-on minarchist. Dave Smith finally convinced me to get into reading again, and I picked up Anatomy of the State, and that's kind of what started me down the rabbit hole of actually reading. I mean, I read comic books and stuff, but, like, real reading. And now I love to do it. But yeah, once I read Anatomy of the State, boom, I was an anarchist. So it's kind of like once you just start reading, period, once you're already down that line of philosophy. But, minarchist is the idea of that, you want a minimum amount of rule, if you will. So usually that's like people usually go with courts, police, and military. Those are usually the basic ones. They believe that should be the minimum. And, most anarchists realize that's a pipe dream, and assuming that it would ever stay to that minimum degree is utter foolishness. But yeah, so, and then anarchist is just that you don't believe we should have that, period. So, I mean, yeah, which there is it's weird. There's like a big divide. I feel like for most of us, it's like you get to minarchist and it's a long time before you finally, or maybe not a long time, but it's a significant jump from minarchist to anarchist, because the implications from one to the other mean a lot. So, yeah, I don't know.
Kind of like a night watchman state, if you will. And
yep.
Well, so we never really defined what a state is. I don't know if we talked about that in the first episode, but a state is, a certain group of people that has a monopoly on the legal right to initiate force against other people in a given territorial area. So that's what we're talking about when we refer to what a state is. I'd never heard that definition before until Anatomy of the State.
Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of the illusion of authority, because at the very root, that's what it is. And by authority, I don't mean someone you're like, oh, they're an authority on this given subject. By authority, you mean someone that you, for some reason, believes has some right to you in your things, like, and that people accept that. So, because the only difference between the mob and the state is perception, is really what it comes down to. Because the difference between it is people perceive that the state has some right to do the things they do. And whereas the idea is, I know a lot of people go like, we'll say like, oh, well, I'm never going to be an anarchist because, we're always going to have a state. But it's like, the idea isn't that. The idea is that you recognize that it's illegitimate and that you don't accept that. You can work around it. I mean, it'd be no different if you had a mob that was running your town or state or whatever. I mean, you could still be like, hey, I don't want to get shot, so I'm going to go along with what they say. But at the end of the day, you still recognize they have no legitimate right to be doing what they're doing, and what they're doing is wrong. So, yeah.
Yeah, and any mob can be a passing, bandit or something like that. It's that what you were getting at in the end. Yeah. What you were getting at in the end, though, is that even if they're, occupying your town and they are forcing you and you have to go along with it, but you don't see them as legitimate. I mean, even that means that their rule will be temporary, because then they just have to keep coercing people, over and over again. Who eventually the gig is going to be up. So,
yeah.
So McMakin then kind of talks about covenant communities. This idea that anarchy doesn't mean no rules; it means no rulers. So you can have a society that's organized. In fact, society largely is organized without the imposition of, the government. You just think about how you help your neighbor, or how communities get together through voluntary efforts to do things. And I think largely local governments get in the way of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, this kind of goes into where we're talking about like the lefty anarchists and where their kind of philosophy falls apart is they generally speaking don't have the same concept of property rights that we do. And the whole idea is, I know a lot of people are like, well, wouldn't technically these covenant communities and be all intents and purposes of government? It's like, yes, but no, because the difference is they have a legitimate claim to this property. And, it's completely changes the game entirely, if someone has a legitimate property claim. And, the same idea is that if I have a house, I get to create the rules. And that doesn't mean I get to like shoot you if you break the. I mean, I guess it kind of does, but I mean, there's proportionality and such. But I have to be like, get out if you're breaking my rules, and then at that point, I have the legitimate right to use whatever force necessary to get you off my property. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of the same basic rules that apply. So that's that. I mean, from there, I guess a lot of people would say that kind of is very much like a state, but it's kind of not, because if they are being, I don't know, I'm kind of getting the weeds there, but basically it's a way to have our cake and eat it too, in a way, kind of deal. It's like we have, you know what I mean?
Well, I mean, this argument isn't valid in the concept of a government, but you can always leave, and leaving is it's allowed, one, but I think it'd be a lot more practical to be able to. So say you live, you move into a certain neighborhood in a city, or maybe you live in a private city, and first off, when you move there, you have to actually sign a contract and agree, or you buy a piece of property knowing that it's encumbered with certain covenants, covenant community. So getting into it, or I guess you could be born into a family that already lives there, and by nature of owning the property, assents to the certain covenants that run with the land. But there's, as opposed to a government situation where I could move to a different town or a different state, and it doesn't matter, the rules still apply to me. I still have to pay taxes. If you're an American citizen, you could move to Africa and you would still have to pay income tax. So I think, but don't quote me on that. So so the next one is talking about, you already mentioned this, but Labonte's Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, saying, we don't have to fight a violent revolution here. All we have to do is withdraw our support for the Colossus.
Mm-hmm. This is why I always say the boog is the big dumb, because it really is just unnecessary. So that's kind of the idea, is just to get everyone to. It's kind of, I was going to earlier, the illusion of authority. If you can just get everyone, you kind of brought up too, the idea that like, if you can get people to recognize that they do not have a legitimate right or claim to what they are doing, then eventually it goes away. It's not sustainable, because then it kind of, then the incentives flip in a sense, because it's like there are these people doing this thing and they have no right to do it, and people are going to start doing stuff like agorism, where they start like disobeying, but they know it's because they do it because they don't feel like they have some obligation to do it. It's like, like people now, like say with like taxes, say we're talking about tax evasion. A lot of people just don't, because they have this idea that like, I have to give the government this. But it's like, if you then be like, hey, it's not theirs, and the only reason you're giving it to them is because they will put you in a cage if you don't, people will start thinking like, well, what can I get away with not giving them? And then over time, the incentives flip, and it's just not sustainable. Yeah.
And I think that we'll have to have a deeper discussion on the boog, because I largely agree with you, and I don't, maybe you won't disagree with what I'm going to say, but essentially there is a point in time where I think it would be justified, but
Yes.
It's about defining when that point is and whether or not, we have a long way to fall before we get to that point, in my opinion.
And it depends on how you define the boog.
Yeah.
I mean, I joke when I say the boog is dumb, I'm usually defining it as like a 1776.2. Like, if you're trying to replace the state with another state, and that's what you're defining, which I feel like a lot of people, that's what they're defining the boog as. If you're just trying to have a violent revolution that just swaps out leaders, no, that's not going to end well for you. At best, you may have a marginal improvement in at the cost of thousands or tens of thousands or hundred thousands or millions of lives. Yeah. So it's like, and most likely it'll be worse.
Yep. And I was just reading a book to my son to put him to bed. He's 2 years old, and I have this old like cardboard, those cardboard books that you have for toddlers. It's about the Declaration of Independence and like the founders, and I it's hard for me. I want him to like know the story, but it's hard to read stuff like that because it's so steeped in the founding mythology. And I'm my wife was there too, and I can't, because I'm an autistic libertarian, I can't help but be like, yeah, well, technically the government that they were living underneath King George was a lot less repressive than what we ended up getting. So, and it's just, it's like that episode from, that movie, The Patriot, with Mel Gibson. At the beginning, he's saying that he's not going to support levying troops to help the Continental Army. And he says, basically, why would I trade one tyrant 3,000 miles away for 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away? And he said, an elected Congress can trample a man's rights just as well as any monarch can. Yeah. So, and I was like, oh shit, he's the real OG anarchist in that movie.
Yeah, he's super base in that movie, but the funny thing is, like, then all his actions go counter. Right, although if you watch that movie, like, he initially, the only reason he gets dragged into it is to kind of like save his son. So I forget the whole story, but he kind of gets dragged into it. But then by the end, he kind of is like sort of coerced into it, and at the end, he's just kind of doing the opposite thing. Like, I don't know. I mean, we could do an analysis of Patriot sometime. That is a good movie, and it is super base, and then it goes the opposite way. Like, God damn it.
I've already done that on this show.
Movie, though. I mean, it's I don't know, especially going back and watching it from like this lens. I watched it, I think, like right around the time the COVID stuff was really kicking off, and there were a few movies around that time that were like really, like almost borderline must sees. Yeah. And I think for some reason, some of the Patriot was one of those, like kind of like stirred up this like, ooh, like, fuck these people trying to, screw us over type thing. Especially when there was that big like boog sentiment at that time. Yeah. I used to be a little bit more boog friendly. So like and like right before the coup stuff was like really starting to kick off, I watched that and I remember like, oh yeah.
I think at that time, I think the Patriot came out in like 99. Mm-hmm. And I think someone pointed out to me that around the turn of the millennium and kind of in the early millennium, it was 2000 it came out, June 2000. And, around that time, there were lots of rah-rah, like patriotic kind of, wondering if they were gearing the public up for a war that was going to come. And then, in 2001, we have, the invasion of Afghanistan, and then 2003 was the invasion of Iraq. And, all these movies you have coming up, you have The Patriot in 2000, you have Saving Private Ryan in 98. I'm just trying to think of more movies that came out during them, like super patriotic movies. But so yeah, anyways, I digress. So let's move forward here.
Let's talk about Operation Mockingbird real quick.
Right?
Just kidding.
Let's see. So then we kind of talk about whether or not. Oh well, we talk about agorism, for a whole bunch of it. But let's just for the sake of time, let's go on to using politics or not using politics to advance liberty. So
literally just yesterday I did a whole, not necessarily debate, but more of a discussion roundtable thing on why libertarian. So anyone's really interested in that, you can go check that out. I'm sure I'll probably release it on my channel soon. But yeah, we had a good discussion on that. But
well, we'll have to link in the show notes page. I've gone back and forth. Like for a long time, I was against voting at all, and I would kind of judge people that voted. Now I think that's part of the purity spiral, which I think is a psyop. Is this purity spiraling? And I've talked about that before on this show.
Everything's a psyop.
Yeah, right. Well, that's literally how the Stasi and the Gestapo, how they would, break up resistance movements, is that they would plant agents in there and they would cause infighting, which sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Which is why I'm not a fan of utilizing the political system.
Yeah.
But I mean, one of many reasons. So as you can tell, I'm very well known for. If anyone's watches, maybe you found me on Patrick's show or mine. I'm sure there's a good reason on both channels, but I am not a fan of that. I am generally not aggressive about it because I come from a strategic standpoint, and so like I can completely get. And strategy is kind of a soft science, so like. I can understand how one could come to either conclusion. So, and it's also one of those things that I could change my mind next year or whatever. I don't know. So there's no reason being an asshole about it. I can change my mind. So I generally try not to. I feel like it's one of those discussions that if someone wants to talk about it, I'll talk about it because I know a lot of anarchists or libertarians get very upset when you tell them that, especially with like the Mises Caucus and the Dave Smith thing going on right now. Especially when I tell them, like, hey, I don't think it's going to work out like you think it will. I think a lot of them very much immediately start reeing. So, but I generally try not to bring it up unless they want to talk about it, and then I'll go into it. But it's one of those things that it's almost not really worth it because, I mean, my stance is it's either a net negative or it doesn't do anything at all. So, I mean, I don't know. It's almost not really worth arguing about most of the time. So, especially because we agree on 99% of things. So, it's just a matter of strategy. So.
Well, I think that excuse me, you and I could have a talk about it because, generally speaking, I have been involved with the Mises Caucus, but generally, I think that they generally agree with what I have. My thoughts about it is that, if you are going to be active in national politics, you should be trying to convince people, doing what Ron Paul did, inspiring people, using the political platform to speak to people and wake people up. On the flip side of that, what the Mises Caucus is really good at is organizing locally, getting local people elected, and doing that grassroots kind of thing, to inform people, teach people, activism, that kind of thing. But, making change at the local level, which is where I think you have infinitely more influence.
Yep.
But, I remain skeptical, as I bet, a whole bunch of Mises Caucus people do even.
Yeah, and I have my arguments against both, and also, and this isn't to say I'm antagonistic. Like the Mises Caucus people are like almost all of my homies, like my online homies, are basically Mises Caucus folks. So I'm basically philosophically there. We just disagree on strategy. Yeah. So yeah.
Well, and I for sure respect your opinion on that too.
Yeah. No, and
you bastard.
Yeah, I mean, I come from more of the agorist thing. I think it generally doesn't serve you to be building up a platform, building up the political route, because that's what we're trying to get away from. And I also think it's honestly, I've been thinking about it a lot lately. It's very much the same thing we were talking about earlier, the incentive problem. Like if you look at politics and how it goes, there are incentives that drive a certain way. And it's like, yeah, you're like, cool, we can use it for messaging or this or that. But it's like the incentives are going to inevitably drive it back the way you don't want to go. And sure, maybe you can get it to get short-term gains, but I think overall you're going to screw yourself over. I mean, this is a whole other deep discussion. So arguments every which way. So, but I think the incentive problem does very much apply to political involvement in general as well. Even if you're just like, oh, we're just going to use it for messaging, because you know what happens? These times where they use it for messaging, I actually think are when they usually do the best. And so then it then reignites this flame of like, we can use this, you know, and then it just, you fall right back into before.
I don't have the ring,
yeah.
You know.
Exactly.
It's a fair point though, and I think there is something about one political office, but certain leadership positions, and I've talked about this on the show too, but there's certain leadership positions that attract a certain type of person, and that person is documented. It's psychopaths. It's people that don't have any conscience. Those are the people who are best at these things, whether it's being a leader in business or politics or anything like that. And so I wouldn't be naive enough to think that libertarianism would be immune to those types of personalities. And I've seen this as a lawyer. Let me tell you, I'm a lawyer, but I don't like lawyers because they're lizard people. And I shit you not, they are lizard people.
Yeah.
So, anyways,
and they put legit plants too. There's a certain prominent individual who has been heavily rumored to be a plant within the Libertarian Party for a long time now.
Yeah. But he can really run a good meeting, you know.
Yeah, I'm sure they do a lot of meetings back at Langley.
So I think we should end on this. I think this is a good note to end on. Dave Smith's quote is, "Everybody is a minarchist who's not an anarchist. An anarchist get accused of being utopian, but there's nothing more utopian than a minarchist."
I agree.
I think that pretty much speaks for itself. So
I think this quote, I feel like a lot of people get pretty annoying about it in some ways, but it also holds true because it depends. You really got to know how to utilize this concept, because there will be times where someone is like having an honest discussion with you and they're like, well, I'm an minarchist and I think we should only have this, that, and this. And then you're like, well, Stalin was a minarchist. And it's like, well, you're not, I mean, okay, sure, technically, but it's like, you're not really fairly representing this individual's perspective. You know what this guy means when he says he's a minarchist. The only point that like Dave is getting at is that this is a good way to demonstrate philosophically how in principle this person is no different than anyone else. So it's not, if someone is using it as a way to tell you where they're coming from, don't use it as a way to misrepresent them. Which, I mean, I don't feel like I should have to say, but I've seen it a lot where people will be like, oh, well, fucking minarchist can be anything. It's like, you if someone says a minarchist, you kind of generally know what they mean. Like, and it depends on how it's going about. If you're in an argument with them online and you're trying to like point out the inconsistencies, it works well. But if they're just trying to show you where they're at, like, don't be a dick.
Right. Yeah, and I think, you know, when it comes to trying to spread liberty and the cause of liberty, I think don't be a dick is generally like a good axiom to live by. But you know, at the same time, you're not always dealing with people who have good intentions. So sometimes it pays to have some scales on you.
Sometimes it makes sense to approach people with derision, especially since we very much usually exist in this online world. You got to take into account that a lot of times you're dealing, like, if you're trying to interact with someone and actually change their mind in one way on a one-on-one, you're going to deal with someone in a much different way than if you know there are onlookers. And in a social media environment, if you're arguing with someone online, you know there are probably tens or hundreds or however many people watching from the outside. So there is something to slam dunking on people and, you know, making fun of them and, you know, just derision in general. It has its place, but also you gotta kind of balance it. That's been something I've been talking about a little bit recently. I kind of joked a little bit that maybe we should develop a new pill. I think I've been proposing the green pill because and that would be someone who's new or learning or on their journey, if you will. Because we have our blue pills, which, I mean, blue pill doesn't actually necessarily mean bad, but I've seen a few examples where, you know, whether it be me or other people dogpile on someone, and you're like, but just if you would just like chill. Like you thought they were a blue pill, but really they're like a new red pill that's on their journey and they're learning, and you just completely shit all over them.
What's the mix between blue and red? Is it purple?
Yeah, it's the purple. Yeah,
Purple's kind of gay though. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, as is anyone that's not a red pill is kind of gay.
Well, so we have now that we're gonna get canceled because something that benign can be canceled, but yeah, fellow travelers is the way I like to put it, you know, and you can be a fellow traveler and be someone like Jimmy Dore or, you know, Caitlin Johnstone. But in our libertarian position, I think, yeah, it's awesome to slam dunk on people when we need to. But if there's a coalition that we can make on people who are good on a certain important issue, I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not as simple as we are very much binary thinkers in a lot of ways, us libertarian folks.
Yeah.
We fall into that trap a lot. And especially when we're talking about interacting with human beings, it's not always binary. So you do have to very much you gotta think this stuff through. Read some things like Bernays and some propaganda, or just, you know, I don't know, just talk to people like a human being and learn how to deal with them. It's not as simple as ones and zeros, which we tend to fall in. That's something I've been talking about a lot lately too, is that we're very much private company, bro. Did it break the NAP? It's always zeros and ones, and sometimes it's not that simple, especially when you're talking about how to interact with human beings, which I think is something we struggle with a lot of times. So just that's something we could use a whole lot more looking into for a lot of us. So
yeah, and it's like right, what you said. It's either, for us, it's either aggression or it's not. Right? Yeah. That's the end of the inquiry.
Yes. It's like, but did they break the NAP? No. Okay. Then
all right. Well, what problem could you have with that? I don't.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, where can people find your work at?
You can find me on YouTube, the No Way Jose YouTube channel. I'm just about everywhere audio podcasts are at as well. I like money, so give me money at patreon.com. So it's No Way Jose 2020. And yeah, that's it.
I'm so crypto hungry right now, but that's another episode. So, all right, man. Well, until next time, we're planning a part 3. Well, that will be the final part.
Yes, it'll be final part. Ideally, I would like to get a special guest. We'll see how that goes. I haven't approached them yet. But if not, I don't know, it might just be me and you again. Not just me and you. Me and you are fucking awesome. But yeah, I mean, we'll see how this goes. I'd like to kind of have the last one go out with a bang. So
yeah. Well, sounds great, man. Well, we'll catch you next time. Thanks everybody for listening.
All right. Thank you.